Imagine this. For 16 years, a single woman terrorized 3 European countries. She left her DNA at 40 different crime scenes. She murdered at least 6 people, including a police officer. She burglarized homes, robbed businesses, and seemed capable of slipping across international borders like a ghost. Police chased her for years. They spent millions of euros. They interviewed thousands of witnesses. They offered a reward of 300,000 euros, nearly $500,000, for any information leading to her capture. They called her the Phantom of Heilbronn. Some knew her as the Woman Without a Face. She was Europe's most wanted criminal, a female serial killer operating at a level few had ever seen. Her crimes spanned from 1993 to 2009, crossing Germany, Austria, and France with apparent ease. Her accomplices were equally diverse and baffling. Slovaks, Serbs, Albanians, Romanians, Iraqis. Men who, when caught and convicted for various crimes, insisted they'd never met her, insisted she didn't exist. No security camera ever captured her image. No witness could describe her face, but her DNA was everywhere, on teacups, cookies, syringes, stolen cars, murder weapons. She was a legend, phantom, the most elusive criminal in modern European history. And then, in March 2009, German police made an announcement that shocked the world. The Phantom of Heilbronn didn't exist. She never had. What police thought was the forensic trail of a prolific female serial killer was actually something far more mundane and far more embarrassing. Contamination. Factory contamination. Cotton swab contamination. The most intensive manhunt in German history had been chasing a woman who worked in an Austrian factory packaging medical supplies. A woman who had no idea her DNA was being spread across crime scenes throughout Europe. A woman who was completely innocent. Now, before I tell you how this happened, I need you to think about something. Where are you right now? What city? What country? What time is it where you are? Drop your location and time in the comments, because this story is about how our absolute faith in forensic science can lead us astray. How the tools we trust most can betray us. Subscribe to this channel if you love stories about forensic mysteries and the limits of science. Like this video. Share it with someone who thinks DNA evidence is infallible. Turn on notifications because what I'm about to tell you changed forensic science forever. This is the story of how Europe's most wanted criminal turned out to be a factory worker's shed skin cells. May 25, 1993. Idar-Oberstein, Germany. Lieselot Schlenger was 62 years old. A church warden and pensioner living quietly in a rented apartment. By all accounts, she was kind, religious, and kept to herself. On the evening of May 25th, someone entered her apartment. They strangled her with thin wire, the kind used to tie flower bouquets together. When police arrived, they found Schlenger dead on her floor. No witnesses, no fingerprints, no obvious suspects. It seemed destined to be another unsolved murder. The kind that goes cold, gets filed away, and is eventually forgotten. But investigators collected evidence anyway. They swabbed surfaces looking for DNA. It was still relatively new technology in 1993, but German police were beginning to use it more frequently. One swab came from the rim of a teacup on Schlenger's kitchen table. That swab contained trace amounts of DNA, just enough to analyze, just enough to create a genetic profile. The profile was entered into the database and filed away. Nobody thought much about it at the time. DNA from a teacup could belong to anyone. A friend who'd visited, a neighbor who'd stopped by for coffee, even Schlenger herself. But that DNA profile would sit in the database waiting for 8 years, until it appeared again. March 21st, 2001. Freiburg, Germany. Joseph Walzenbach, a 61-year-old antiques dealer, was found strangled in his home with garden twine. Like the Schlenger case 8 years earlier, there were no witnesses, no fingerprints, no clear motive. Police collected DNA evidence from the scene, from Walzenbach's possessions, from surfaces the killer might have touched. And when they analyzed it, something extraordinary happened. The DNA matched. matched what? The DNA from Lieselot Schlenger's teacup. From 1993, 8 years earlier, a completely different city, a completely different victim, same DNA. This meant one thing: the two murders were connected. The same person had been in both apartments, had touched that teacup in 1993 and Walzenbacher's possessions in 2001. Investigators were intrigued but cautious. 2 data points weren't enough to call it a pattern. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe the DNA belonged to someone who'd known both victims. Maybe there was a rational explanation. But then the DNA started appearing more frequently. A lot more frequently. Between 2001 and 2009, the same female DNA profile appeared at crime scene after crime scene after crime scene. Burglaries, home invasions, robberies, assaults, murders. The crimes had no obvious connection, no pattern in victim selection, no consistent modus operandi. A stone used to smash a window during a 2006 break-in in Saarbrücken. Phantom DNA. A disused public swimming pool after a burglary in Niederstetten. Phantom DNA. 4 separate home invasions in Quierschied, Tholi, and Rial. Phantom DNA at all 4. A syringe found at a drug-related crime scene. Phantom DNA. A cookie at another burglary. Phantom DNA. Inside cars used in various crimes. Phantom DNA. By 2008, investigators had connected this mysterious woman to nearly 40 different crimes across Germany, Austria, and France. The media began covering the case extensively. Who was this woman? How was she evading capture across 3 countries? Why were her crimes so varied and apparently random? Profilers were brought in from across Europe to analyze the pattern. But there was no pattern. That was the problem. The only connection between these crimes was the DNA. Always the same DNA. Always female. Always present. And then, in April 2007, the Phantom committed her most audacious crime yet. A crime that would make her name known across all of Europe. April 25, 2007. Heilbronn, Germany. 2 police officers, Michelle Kieswetter, 22, and Martin Arnold, 24, were sitting in their patrol car near a fairground in Heilbronn, eating lunch during their break. At approximately 2 p.m., someone approached the car from behind. 2 shots rang out. Both officers were shot in the head at point-blank range. Michelle Kieswetter died instantly. Martin Arnold survived but was critically wounded and fell into a coma. The attack was brazen, execution style, in broad daylight, against police officers. This wasn't a burglary gone wrong or a crime of opportunity. This was targeted, professional. When Arnold eventually woke from his coma weeks later, he had no memory of the attack, couldn't describe the shooter, couldn't explain what had happened. But investigators found something crucial at the scene. DNA. Female DNA. The same DNA that had appeared at nearly 40 other crime scenes across Europe. The Phantom had killed a cop. The murder of Michelle Kieswetter changed everything. Before this, the Phantom had been an investigation, a curiosity, puzzle. Now she was a cop killer, and that made it personal for law enforcement across Europe. A special task force was created in Heilbronn called Parkplatz, parking lot, named after where Kieswetter was killed. More than 100 police officers were assigned to the case full-time. The reward was increased, first to 100,000 euros, then 200,000 euros, eventually reaching 300,000 euros. Psychics and fortune-tellers were consulted. Not officially, of course, but some investigators were so desperate they reached out to anyone who might help. Profilers created elaborate theories about who this woman might be. A professional assassin working for organized crime? A mentally ill woman on a crime spree? Multiple women using the same identity? A woman with accomplices who did the actual crimes while she stayed nearby? The theories grew more elaborate as the case dragged on with no breaks, and her list of apparent accomplices continued to baffle investigators. One of the most bizarre aspects of the Phantom case was her supposed accomplices. In several crimes where the Phantom's DNA was found, other people had been caught and convicted. But when asked about the mysterious woman whose DNA appeared at the scene, every single accomplice said the same thing. "I don't know who you're talking about. There was no woman. I worked alone," or "I worked with the people you already arrested." A car dealership robbery. Convicted criminal denied any female accomplice existed. A school break-in, same story. No woman involved. Multiple burglaries where her DNA appeared. The convicted burglars insisted they'd never worked with any woman matching the Phantom's profile. How was this possible? One theory was that the Phantom was so skilled at remaining hidden that even her accomplices never actually saw her. She stayed in the car, coordinated from a distance, never revealed herself. Another theory was that these criminals were protecting her, staying silent out of fear or loyalty. But the simplest explanation, that they were telling the truth and there really was no woman, never seemed to occur to anyone. Because the DNA doesn't lie, right? By 2008, some investigators were starting to have doubts. Not about whether the Phantom existed, the DNA evidence seemed irrefutable, but about whether all these crimes were really connected. The sheer diversity of the crimes was troubling. Murders, burglaries, car thefts, assaults, drug crimes. Serial criminals typically have a pattern, preferred victim type, a consistent method. The Phantom had none of that, and her geographic range was enormous. She'd apparently committed crimes hundreds of kilometers apart within days of each other. Some forensic specialists began quietly suggesting that maybe, just maybe, there was contamination involved, but they were dismissed. How could there be contamination when the DNA appeared at so many different crime scenes, investigated by different police departments, analyzed by different labs? Contamination would have to be systematic, widespread, present in multiple jurisdictions across 3 countries. That seemed impossible. And besides, the DNA profile was so specific, so detailed, clearly came from a real person. So the investigation continued. More resources, more man-hours, more desperation. And then, in early 2009, something strange happened that would finally crack the case open. 2002. A burned body was discovered near the German-French border. The victim was so badly charred that identification was nearly impossible. No face, no identifying marks, no ID on the body. The case sat unsolved for years. In 2009, investigators decided to try again. They had fingerprints from the burned corpse, and they had asylum application records from a male asylum seeker who disappeared in 2002 around the same time and place. They compared the fingerprints from the corpse to the fingerprints from the asylum application. Match. The burned body was the missing asylum seeker, but as part of standard procedure, they also swabbed the asylum application form to collect any DNA that might be present. And when they analyzed that DNA, they got a result that made no sense whatsoever. The DNA from the male asylum seeker's application form belonged to a woman. Not just any woman. The Phantom of Heilbronn. This was impossible. The asylum seeker was definitely male. The fingerprints confirmed it. The records confirmed it. But his application form apparently had the Phantom's DNA on it. Confused investigators decided to retest. They took another swab from the application form, this time using a different cotton swab. And this time, the Phantom's DNA wasn't there. Someone stared at those 2 results for a long moment. And then they understood. The DNA wasn't on the application form. It was on the cotton swab. Before we continue, I need to check. Are you still with me? What time is it where you are? Where in the world are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Like this video, share it, turn on notifications. Because what comes next is the revelation that brought down one of Europe's biggest criminal investigations and changed forensic science forever. March 26, 2009. German police held a press conference that would shock the nation. They announced that the Phantom of Heilbronn did not exist. There was no female serial killer terrorizing Europe. There was no woman connected to 40 different crimes. There was no mysterious criminal mastermind evading capture for 16 years. There was only contaminated cotton swabs. Here's what had happened. The cotton swabs used by many German and Austrian police departments to collect DNA evidence all came from the same Austrian factory, Grainer Bio 1 International AG. The swabs were sterilized during manufacturing. That sterilization killed bacteria, viruses, and fungi, but it didn't remove human DNA. And at some point during the manufacturing or packaging process, the swabs had been contaminated with DNA from one of the factory workers. A woman who worked at the factory, an innocent woman who had no idea her shed skin cells, her sweat, her saliva, microscopic amounts of biological material, had somehow ended up on cotton swabs that would then be shipped across Europe and used to collect DNA evidence at crime scenes. Every time a police officer used one of these contaminated swabs, they weren't just collecting evidence from the crime scene. They were depositing the factory worker's DNA onto the evidence. The Phantom wasn't bringing her DNA to crime scenes. The police were. To understand how this could happen, you need to understand how cotton swabs are manufactured and how DNA evidence is collected. Cotton swabs, the kind used in forensic investigations, are simple devices. A wooden or plastic stick with cotton wound around the end. The cotton is harvested, processed, wound onto sticks, packaged, sterilized, shipped. At multiple points in this process, human beings handle the materials. They pick the cotton. They operate the machinery. They package the finished swabs. And every human being sheds DNA constantly. Skin cells, hair, sweat, saliva, microscopic amounts that we never notice in daily life but that modern DNA testing can detect with incredible sensitivity. The sterilization process used by manufacturers kills living organisms. But DNA isn't alive. It's just a molecule. Sterilization doesn't destroy it. So these cotton swabs went out labeled as sterile, meaning free of bacteria and viruses. But nobody had ever tested them for human DNA contamination. Why would they? In the 1990s and early 2000s, DNA testing wasn't sensitive enough to pick up trace contamination like this. But by the mid-2000s, DNA technology had advanced dramatically. Tests could now detect DNA from just a few cells, from skin particles invisible to the naked eye. The sensitivity that made DNA testing such a powerful forensic tool had also made it vulnerable to contamination in ways nobody had anticipated. And because all the contaminated swabs came from the same factory, they all had the same woman's DNA on them, creating the illusion of a single criminal appearing at multiple crime scenes. The woman whose DNA created the Phantom has never been publicly identified. German and Austrian authorities made a conscious decision not to reveal her name. She was innocent, completely innocent. She'd done nothing wrong except work at a factory. Revealing her identity would serve no purpose except to subject her to unwanted attention, harassment, and possibly worse. What we know about her comes from the mitochondrial DNA analysis that was eventually done. She was of Eastern European descent. The DNA showed characteristics most common in populations from Eastern Europe and neighboring Russia. She worked at the Grainer Bio 1 factory in Austria, which employed several Eastern European women during the relevant time period. She'd been shedding microscopic amounts of biological material onto cotton swabs during the manufacturing process. Not through carelessness, not through malice, just through the normal process of being human. Somewhere in Austria, there's a woman who may or may not know that for 16 years, police across Europe were hunting her DNA signature, that her genetic material was blamed for murders, burglaries, assaults, and robberies, that millions of euros were spent chasing a phantom created by her shed skin cells. She's probably in her 50s or 60s now. Maybe still living in Austria. Maybe she moved elsewhere. Maybe she knows. Maybe she doesn't. Either way, she's blameless. The fault lay elsewhere. One detail made the contamination theory even more convincing. Bavaria, the German state immediately south of where many of the Phantom's crimes occurred, never found any evidence of the Phantom. Not once. In over 16 years. Why? Because Bavarian police bought their cotton swabs from a different supplier. Not Grainer Bio 1, a different factory entirely. So while police in Baden-Württemberg, Hesse, and other German states were finding the phantom's DNA everywhere, Bavarian police found nothing. It was a perfect natural experiment. Same country, same time period, same types of crimes being investigated, but different cotton swabs, and no phantom. This single fact demolished any remaining doubt about the contamination theory. If the phantom were real, why would she avoid Bavaria so completely? Why would she operate extensively just north of the Bavarian border but never cross it? The answer was obvious. She wasn't avoiding Bavaria. Bavaria's police just weren't using contaminated swabs. The revelation that the phantom didn't exist sent shockwaves through European law enforcement. 16 years of investigation. Wasted. An estimated €2 million spent. For nothing. Over 16,000 hours of police overtime. Chasing a ghost. Hundreds of witnesses interviewed. Thousands of tips followed up. Countless man-hours analyzing evidence that was meaningless. And worst of all, real criminals had escaped closer scrutiny because investigators were convinced the phantom was involved. The murder of Michel Kieswetter, the young police officer killed in Heilbronn, that case had to be completely reinvestigated from scratch. The various burglaries, assaults, and robberies where the phantom's DNA appeared, all had to be re-examined without the assumption that a mysterious female accomplice was involved. Some cases were solved once investigators stopped looking for the phantom. Others remained unsolved, but at least now investigators weren't chasing false leads. The embarrassment was immense. German newspapers had a field day. Bild, Germany's largest tabloid, ran the headline, "Are the heads of our police stuffed with cotton wool?" It was brutal, humiliating, and deserved. In 2011, 2 years after the phantom was revealed to be contamination, police finally solved the murder of Michel Kieswetter. The killers weren't a mysterious female serial criminal. They were members of a neo-Nazi terrorist cell called the National Socialist Underground, NSU. The NSU had committed at least 10 murders between 2000 and 2007, mostly targeting immigrants and people of Turkish descent. The murder of Kieswetter didn't fit their usual pattern, which is partly why it had been so hard to solve. But eventually, evidence linked the NSU to her killing. In 2011, 2 of the NSU members died in an apparent murder-suicide. A third member, Beats Shape, was arrested and later convicted. The case was solved, finally, but only after wasting years looking for a phantom who never existed. How many other cases suffered similar delays? How many other investigations were derailed by contaminated evidence? We'll never know for sure. The Phantom of Heilbronn case forced a complete rethinking of forensic protocols across Europe. In 2016, the International Organization for Standardization, ISO, published ISO 18385, a new standard specifically addressing DNA contamination in forensic consumables. This standard requires that cotton swabs, collection tubes, and other materials used in DNA evidence collection be manufactured to be DNA-free, not just sterile. It establishes protocols for testing raw materials for DNA contamination before manufacturing, minimizing human contact during the manufacturing process, regular testing of finished products for DNA traces, certification that products meet DNA-free standards, proper labeling indicating products are suitable for forensic DNA collection. Manufacturers who want to sell to law enforcement and forensic labs now have to meet these standards. Labs are required to validate that their consumables are actually DNA-free before using them in casework. The reforms came too late for the Phantom investigation, but they've prevented similar disasters from occurring since. It's a classic case of closing the barn door after the horse has bolted. But at least the door is closed now. Interestingly, the Phantom of Heilbronn wasn't the only case of systematic DNA contamination. In the winter of 2025, the Hennepin County Forensic Laboratory in Minneapolis, Minnesota, discovered their own phantom. The lab shut down DNA operations for 79 days after finding that plastic 96 well plates used in routine DNA work were contaminated with human DNA. The DNA didn't match any employee, didn't match anyone in national databases. They traced it back through supply chains but couldn't identify its source. The contamination had potentially affected tens of thousands of DNA profiles processed since 2016. Fortunately, after extensive review, they found fewer than 10 cases requiring retesting. But it was a stark reminder. The Phantom of Heilbronn taught forensic science an important lesson, but contamination remains an ongoing risk. The Hennepin case was caught early because of the protocols established after Heilbronn. Regular quality control, systematic testing, awareness of contamination risks. These reforms work, but they require constant vigilance. The Phantom of Heilbronn case also highlighted something uncomfortable for the criminal justice system. DNA evidence, despite being portrayed as near-infallible, has significant limitations. Stefan Koenig of the Berlin Association of Lawyers said it best after the Phantom revelation. DNA analysis is a perfect tool for identifying traces. What we need to avoid is the assumption that the producer of the traces is automatically the culprit. Judges tend to be so blinded by the shiny, seemingly perfect evidence of DNA traces that they sometimes ignore the whole picture. DNA evidence at a crime scene says nothing about how it got there. This is crucial to understand. DNA evidence tells you who. It doesn't tell you when, why, or how. If your DNA is found at a crime scene, it could mean you committed the crime. You were at the scene before the crime. You were at the scene after the crime. Your DNA was transferred there by someone else. Your DNA was on equipment used to collect evidence. Your DNA contaminated the lab processing the evidence. DNA is a tool, a very powerful tool, but it's not magic. It requires context, corroboration, careful interpretation. The Phantom case showed what happens when we forget that. Could another Phantom emerge? Could contamination create another false criminal that investigators chase for years? It's possible, but less likely now. The ISO 18385 standard has significantly reduced the risk of manufacturing contamination. Labs are more aware of contamination risks and take more precautions. Quality control procedures are more robust, but new risks keep emerging. As DNA testing becomes more sensitive, it picks up smaller and smaller amounts of biological material. This is great for solving cold cases where only trace evidence exists. But it also means we're more vulnerable to contamination from unexpected sources. A forensic technician who touched evidence without gloves. A police officer who sneezed near a crime scene. DNA transferred from one piece of evidence to another in the lab. Touch DNA or trace DNA is incredibly powerful, but it's also incredibly fragile and easily contaminated. The key is remembering the lesson of the Phantom. No matter how compelling DNA evidence seems, it must be considered in context. It must be corroborated by other evidence. And we must always ask, how did this DNA get here? 16 years, 40 crime scenes, 6 murders, countless burglaries and assaults, all connected by DNA evidence from a woman who never existed as a criminal. The Phantom of Heilbronn is one of the most bizarre cases in forensic history. Not because of what happened, but because of what didn't happen. There was no criminal mastermind, no serial killer, no phantom, just cotton swabs contaminated by an innocent factory worker's shed skin cells. Just police who trusted their tools without questioning them. Just perfect storm of advancing technology, inadequate quality control, and confirmation bias. The real criminals, the NSU terrorists who killed Michelle Kieswetter, the burglars who robbed homes, the murderers who killed Lieselot Schlenger and Joseph Walzenbach, they benefited from the distraction. While police chased a phantom, real criminals went about their business. Some were eventually caught, others weren't. And somewhere in Austria, there's a woman who may or may not know that her DNA signature became Europe's most wanted. That for 16 years, she was the Phantom. The woman without a face. The serial killer who never killed anyone. Picture Stockholm in 1932. Cobblestone streets wet from spring rain. Gothic architecture casting shadows across neighborhoods where gas lamps still flickered at night. A city caught between the old world and the new, where folklore and modernity walked hand in hand through the same dark alleys. It was a time when people still whispered about vampires, not as fiction, not as entertainment, but as something that might actually exist in the shadows between what science could explain and what the human heart feared. April 30th, 1932, Walpurgis Night, the Swedish celebration of spring, but also an ancient night steeped in folklore about witches and dark magic. A night when, tradition said, the boundary between the natural and supernatural grew thin. On that night, in a small apartment in Stockholm's Atlas district, something happened that would give credence to the oldest superstitions. Something so bizarre, so grotesque, so utterly inexplicable that even now, more than 90 years later, nobody can fully explain it. A woman would be murdered, but not just murdered, drained, consumed, left in a state that would cause hardened police detectives to wonder if perhaps the old stories were true after all. Her name was Lili Lindström. She was 32 years old, and what happened to her would become Sweden's most haunting unsolved murder. The case that would come to be known as the Atlas Vampire. Here's where I need to stop and ask, where are you right now? What city are you in? What time of day or night is it as you listen to this? Because this story I'm about to tell you happened during a specific time, late evening turning into early morning on Walpurgis Night, 1932. And there's something about knowing when and where you're hearing it that connects us across time. Drop your location and the time in the comments. Subscribe to this channel if you love mysteries that have never been solved. Like this video, share it with someone who appreciates gothic true crime. Turn on notifications because this is a story you won't want to miss a single chapter of. Now let me take you back to Stockholm, to the Atlas district, to an apartment building where two women lived, both working in the world's oldest profession, both looking out for each other in a city that could be dangerous for women like them. One of them would die horribly, the other would be the last person to see her alive. And between them, on that Walpurgis night, a mystery was born that would never be solved. The Atlas district of Stockholm in 1932 was not a wealthy neighborhood. It was part of Väsastan, an area that had once been industrial but was transforming into a residential quarter. The buildings were neo-Renaissance style, beautiful in their architecture but modest in their accommodations. The apartments were small, dark, cramped. Most had no running water in the units themselves. Residents shared communal bathrooms down hallways. Privacy was a luxury few could afford, but it was exactly this kind of neighborhood, working class, transient, where people minded their own business, that made it perfect for women like Lili Lindström and her friend Minnie Jansen. Both women were sex workers, but not the kind who walked the streets. They were what, in 1932, was called call girls. They worked from their apartments. Their clients contacted them, usually through intermediaries or word of mouth, and came to them. It was safer than street work, more discreet, more controlled. Lili lived at Sankt Eriksplan 11, a building that still stands today. Her apartment was on an upper floor, small, one room that served as bedroom, living space, and place of business. But Lili had something special, something that made her stand out from other sex workers in Stockholm at that time. She had a telephone. In 1932, having a private telephone was rare. Most people didn't have them. They used public phones or had messages delivered. For a sex worker to have a personal telephone line in her apartment was almost unheard of. This told you something about Lili. She was successful. She had regular clients. Clients who could afford to pay well enough that she could afford luxuries like a phone line. Minnie Jansen lived in the same building, one floor below Lili. They were friends. More than friends, they were each other's safety system. Because no matter how controlled and safe their work seemed compared to street walking, it was still dangerous. They were still inviting strange men into their private spaces. Men who could be anyone. Men who might want to hurt them. So Lili and Minnie had developed a system. When one of them had a client, the other would check in. A knock on the door. A borrowed item, usually a condom, which served the dual purpose of actually being needed and providing a legitimate excuse to interrupt. It was Minnie Jansen, who was downstairs in her own apartment, heard nothing unusual. No screaming, no sounds of struggle, no indication that anything was wrong. Shortly after the phone call, There was a knock on Minnie's door. It was Lily. "Can I borrow a condom?" she asked. This was their signal. Everything was fine. Lily had a client. She was letting Minnie know she was working. Minnie gave her a condom and Lily went back upstairs. A short while later, perhaps 20 or 30 minutes, there was another knock. Lily again. "The first one broke," she said. "Can I have another?" Minnie gave her a second condom. Lily smiled, thanked her, and went back upstairs to her apartment. That was the last time Minnie Jansen saw her friend alive. The next day was May 1st. Walpurgis night had passed into May Day. Stockholm was celebrating spring. People were out in the streets, enjoying the carnival-like atmosphere that traditionally followed Walpurgis night. Minnie assumed Lily was out celebrating too, or sleeping late after a busy night. May 2nd passed. Still no sign of Lily. May 3rd. Still nothing. By May 4th, Minnie was worried. She went upstairs and knocked on Lily's door. No answer. She knocked louder. Still nothing. She called Lily's phone number. It rang and rang. Nobody picked up. Minnie tried the door handle. Locked. She pressed her ear to the door and listened. Nothing. Just silence. But there was something else. A smell. Faint but unmistakable. The smell of decay. Minnie Jansen knew what that smell meant. She ran to the police station. The Stockholm police who responded to Minnie Jansen's report didn't take it seriously at first. A missing prostitute? She'd probably just gone away for a few days. Maybe found a rich client who'd taken her somewhere nice. Maybe decided to leave the profession and moved to another city. But Minnie was insistent. Something was wrong. She could smell it. Literally. Finally, the officers agreed to check. They went to Sankt Eriksplan 11, climbed the stairs to Lily's apartment, knocked on the door. No answer. They could smell it too now. That sweet, sickly smell of decomposition. They broke down the door, and what they found inside would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Lily Lindeström's body lay face down on her bed, completely naked. Her clothes were folded neatly on a chair beside the bed, shirt, skirt, undergarments, all carefully arranged. Her head rested on her left arm. There was blood on the bed beneath her head, a large wound on the right side of her skull. But it was what they noticed next that made this more than just another tragic murder. Her skin was pale, unnaturally pale, almost white, and when the police doctor examined her body, he made a discovery that would give this case its infamous name. Lily Lindeström had been drained of almost all her blood. The autopsy of Lily Lindeström was conducted by a Stockholm medical examiner who had seen many murder victims in his career, but he'd never seen anything quite like this. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head. 3 heavy blows, likely from a pipe or similar rounded, heavy object. The blows had crushed her skull. She would have died quickly, probably unconscious from the first blow. But that wasn't the disturbing part. The disturbing part was what had happened after she died. Lily's body contained almost no blood. Her heart, her major blood vessels, her organs, all were pale, empty, drained. Yet there were no puncture wounds, no cuts beyond the head trauma, no obvious point of drainage. Her neck showed traces of saliva. Someone had licked her, kissed her, tasted her. Evidence of recent sexual activity was obvious. A condom was found still protruding from her anus, suggesting she'd been killed during or immediately after sex. Semen was collected. In 1932, this meant nothing for identification purposes. DNA testing was still decades away, but it confirmed what they already suspected. Her killer had been intimate with her before murdering her. The time of death was estimated at 2 to 3 days before discovery, which meant she'd been killed on May 1st or 2nd. Most likely the night of April 30th or early morning May 1st, right around the time Minnie had last seen her. But the question that consumed the investigators was, how had the killer drained her blood? And why? 6 weeks after Lily Lindeström's body was discovered, police made another finding that would cement this case's macabre reputation. In the kitchen area of Lily's small apartment, investigators found a gravy ladle. It was dented, damaged, and it had dried blood on it. The blood was tested. It matched Lily's blood type. The implications were horrifying. The killer had used the ladle to collect Lily's blood, and based on the amount of blood missing from her body, he'd used it multiple times, filling it, consuming it, filling it again. How he'd extracted the blood without any obvious wounds remained a mystery. Some investigators theorized he'd positioned her body to allow blood to drain from the head wound into some kind of container. Others thought perhaps he'd used the ladle to scoop blood directly from her mouth or nose as it pooled there. But the most disturbing theory was simpler. He'd drunk it while she was still dying, while her heart was still pumping, while blood was still flowing from her crushed skull. The Swedish press had been covering the case since Lily's body was discovered. But it was the discovery of the gravy ladle that gave them the name that would stick forever. Vampirmordet, the vampire murder, and the unknown killer became known as Atlas Vampiren, the Atlas Vampire. Stockholm had a monster, a real one, not from folklore or legend, but walking the streets, looking like anyone else, hiding among the population. And nobody knew who he was. Let's return to that apartment and examine what investigators actually found. The room was small, perhaps 12 by 15 feet. One window looking out onto the street below. A bed, a chair, a small kitchen area with a sink and hot plate, a wardrobe. The bed was where Lily's body had been found, face down, left arm under her head, right arm at her side. The bedding was relatively clean. There wasn't the massive amount of blood you'd expect from someone who'd had their skull crushed, which suggested the killer had been careful, had controlled the blood flow, had perhaps even cleaned up after himself to some degree. Lily's clothes on the chair were folded with care, not thrown, not ripped off in passion or violence. Folded. This suggested she'd undressed herself, prepared for sex. The client hadn't torn her clothes off in a frenzy. There were no signs of struggle in the room.
No overturned furniture.
No scratches on the walls or floor. Nothing broken except that gravy ladle, which meant Lily probably hadn't fought back. Either she'd been taken by complete surprise, killed with that first blow before she could react, or she'd trusted her killer enough not to see it coming. The condom found protruding from her body was examined. Contained semen. But in 1932, that was as far as the analysis could go. Fingerprints were found throughout the apartment, on doorknobs, on the wardrobe, on the bed frame, on the gravy ladle. But in 1932, fingerprint databases were limited. Unless the police had a suspect to compare the prints to, they were useless. Hair was found that didn't match Lily's. Male hair, probably from the killer. Again, useless without DNA technology. The crime scene was, in many ways, a forensic goldmine. But the technology to properly analyze it wouldn't exist for another 50 years. The Atlas Vampire had left behind everything investigators would need to identify him. Except he'd left it 50 years too early. The Stockholm Police Department threw substantial resources at the Atlas Vampire case. It was sensational. The press was all over it. The public was terrified. There was pressure from politicians, from civic leaders, from everyone to catch this monster. Detectives began interviewing everyone in the building at Sankt Eriksplan 11. Had anyone seen a man entering or leaving Lily's apartment on the night of April 30th or morning of May 1st? No. Nobody had seen anything unusual. Had anyone heard anything? Screaming? Sounds of struggle? Heavy footsteps? No. The building had been quiet that night. How was that possible? How could someone murder a woman, spend time draining her blood, and leave without anyone noticing? The answer probably lay in the nature of the building and the neighborhood. People in the Atlas district minded their own business. They didn't ask questions. They didn't spy on their neighbors. And on Walpurgis night, many people were out celebrating. The building may have been emptier than usual. The investigators moved on to interviewing Lily's known clients. Minnie Jansen provided names, descriptions, details about men who'd visited Lily regularly. Each one was tracked down, interviewed, their whereabouts on April 30th verified. Some had alibis, some didn't. but none of them seemed likely suspects. None of them matched the fingerprints from the apartment. None of them had any known history of violence. Most were respectable men, businessmen, professionals, married men visiting a discreet call girl. The investigation expanded to the broader sex worker community in Stockholm. Had anyone else had experiences with violent clients? Anyone who'd expressed interest in blood? Anyone with strange requests? A few names came up. A few suspects were investigated, but nothing stuck. Before we go further, I need to pause and ask, are you still with me? What time is it where you are now? Where in the world are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel. Like this video, share it, turn on notifications, because what comes next is where the case gets even stranger, where the theories start ranging from the plausible to the absolutely bizarre. Over the course of the investigation, Stockholm police interviewed dozens of potential suspects. Some were Lily's regular clients, businessmen, lawyers, a doctor, even a police officer who'd been known to visit her occasionally. Each was questioned. Each provided an alibi or explanation. Each was eventually cleared, but there were a few who remained under suspicion longer than others. Suspect number 1, the married businessman. A wealthy businessman who'd been seeing Lily regularly for over a year. He had a wife and children, a respectable position in Stockholm society. He admitted to being one of Lily's clients, but he claimed he hadn't seen her in over a week before her death. His wife confirmed he'd been home the night of April 30th. But wives lie for husbands, especially when the alternative is social ruin. Police investigated him thoroughly, searched his home, found nothing. He was eventually cleared, but some investigators never fully believed his alibi. Suspect number 2, the sailor. A merchant sailor who'd been in port in Stockholm during late April and early May. He matched the description of a man seen in the Atlas district around the time of the murder. Dark hair, medium build, foreign accent. He had no alibi for the night of April 30th. Claimed he'd been walking around the city alone, but his ship's manifest showed he'd been scheduled to sail on May 2nd. Why would he kill someone right before leaving the country? And his fingerprints didn't match those found in Lily's apartment. He was cleared. Suspect number 3, the medical student. A young medical student who'd been known to frequent the Atlas district looking for prostitutes. He had knowledge of anatomy, access to medical instruments, an interest in blood and bodies. Several sex workers reported he'd made uncomfortable requests, asked if he could draw their blood, offered to pay extra for unusual experiences. Police brought him in for questioning. He admitted to being in the Atlas district on April 30th, but he claimed he'd been with a different prostitute that night. Not Lily. The other prostitute confirmed his story. His fingerprints didn't match those from the crime scene. He was cleared, but he remained under surveillance for months afterward. None of these suspects panned out, and as summer turned to fall in 1932, the investigation began to lose momentum. As the official investigation stalled, theories about the Atlas vampire began to proliferate. Some were grounded in criminology and psychology. Others ventured into the supernatural. Theory number 1. A client she didn't know ***. Minnie Jansen had told police that Lily seemed confused by the phone call she received on April 30th, as if she didn't immediately recognize the caller's voice. This suggested the killer might have been a new client, someone Lily hadn't met before. But Lily was careful about new clients. She usually required references. She didn't give her phone number to strangers. So how had he gotten it? Theory number 2. Someone with medical knowledge. The precision with which the blood had been drained suggested someone with medical or anatomical knowledge. A doctor, a medical student, a butcher, someone who understood how blood flows through the body. But how many doctors or medical students would be visiting prostitutes? And of those who did, how many would have the knowledge and inclination to commit such a bizarre crime? Theory number 3. A police officer. This was the darkest theory. The the one that made the investigation itself uncomfortable. What if the killer was a police officer? That would explain why no arrests were made, why the investigation seemed to stall, why certain leads weren't pursued as vigorously as they should have been. A police officer would know how to avoid leaving traceable evidence, would know how to manipulate an investigation, would know how to cover his tracks. The theory gained traction when it was revealed that at least one police officer had been a client of Lily's. He was investigated, cleared. His colleagues vouched for him, but suspicion lingered. Theory number 4, the real vampire. And then there was the theory that the Swedish press loved and the police hated. What if the killer really was a vampire? Not metaphorically. Actually, it would explain the drained blood, the lack of witnesses, the seemingly supernatural ability to avoid capture. Folklore experts were consulted. They noted that Walpurgis Night was traditionally associated with supernatural activity, that vampires were said to be most active during liminal times, transitions between seasons, between day and night. The theory was ridiculous. Obviously, wasn't it? Modern criminologists and psychologists looking back at the Atlas vampire case have proposed another theory. The killer may have suffered from what's now called clinical vampirism or Renfield syndrome. This is a psychiatric condition in which individuals become obsessed with blood. They derive sexual pleasure from consuming it. They believe drinking blood gives them power or vitality. The condition is named after Renfield, a character in Bram Stoker's Dracula who eats living creatures to absorb their life force. People with Renfield syndrome typically progress through stages. First, they discover that drinking blood, even their own, produces a pleasurable sensation. Then they move to drinking animal blood. Finally, they escalate to human blood, often obtained through sexual encounters. The condition is rare, but it's real. And there have been documented cases throughout history. Fritz Haarmann, the vampire of Hanover, killed at least 24 young men in Germany in the 1920s, biting through their throats and drinking their blood. Peter Kürten, the vampire of Dusseldorf, killed at least 9 people in the late 1920s and early 1930s, drinking blood from their wounds. Both were active around the same time as the Atlas vampire. Could the Stockholm killer have suffered from the same condition? It would explain the blood drinking, the apparent sexual component, the lack of further similar crimes. Perhaps he satisfied his urges with that one incident and then controlled them afterward. Or perhaps he died shortly after. Illness.
Accident.
Suicide from guilt. We'll never know. By 1933, the Atlas vampire investigation had essentially gone cold. Police had interviewed hundreds of people, followed dozens of leads, spent countless hours analyzing the crime scene and evidence. But they had no suspect.
No arrest. No conviction.
The case file was moved to the Unsolved Murders section, where it remained for decades. Periodically, a new detective would pull the file, review it, try to find something previous investigators had missed. But the evidence from 1932 couldn't yield the secrets it held. Not without modern forensic technology. The fingerprints remained unmatched. The hair samples sat in evidence bags, useless without DNA analysis. The semen samples degraded over time. By the 1960s, most of the original investigators had retired or died. The witnesses who'd been interviewed in 1932 were old or deceased. Any chance of solving the case through traditional detective work was gone. The Atlas vampire had won, had gotten away with murder, had disappeared back into whatever darkness had spawned him. But the case never truly died. It lived on in Stockholm folklore, in late-night conversations, in the collective memory of a city that had once been terrorized by a monster it couldn't catch. Today, if you visit Stockholm's police museum, you can see evidence from the Atlas vampire case on display. There's a glass case containing items from Lily Lindeström's apartment, condom wrappers, photographs of the crime scene, a schematic diagram of her apartment layout. The gravy ladle, with its dried bloodstains, is the centerpiece. Dented, sinister, a mundane kitchen implement transformed into an artifact of horror. Visitors stand before the display case and stare. Some take photos. Some read the placard explaining the case. Most leave with an unsettled feeling, because the case is still unsolved. Because somewhere out there, or perhaps in a grave somewhere, is a person who killed Lili Lindström and was never caught. The museum doesn't sensationalize the case, presents it factually. But there's something about seeing the actual physical evidence that makes it more real, more disturbing. This wasn't a movie. This wasn't fiction. A real woman died horribly. A real killer escaped justice. And all that remains are these artifacts behind glass. In 2012, a woman named Gloria Anderson wrote a blog post about living in the same building where Lili was murdered. Anderson lived on the opposite side of the building from where Lili's apartment had been. But she said she always felt uncomfortable in the wing where the murder occurred. Not because she believed in ghosts. She didn't. But because knowing what had happened there, knowing that someone had been murdered so horribly in that space, created an atmosphere she couldn't shake. History has weight. Tragedy leaves traces. Even 90 years later, in 2021, advanced forensic DNA technology was used to identify victims and solve cold cases that had been unsolved for decades. The Golden State Killer was caught using familial DNA matching. Murder victims from the 1970s were finally identified using genetic genealogy. Could the same technology solve the Atlas vampire case? Theoretically, yes. The evidence still exists. It's preserved in the Stockholm Police Museum. The hair samples, the bodily fluids, the fingerprints. With modern DNA extraction techniques, it might be possible to develop a genetic profile of the killer. That profile could be run through genealogical databases. Familial matches could be found. Living relatives of the killer could be identified. But there are problems. First, the evidence is nearly 100 years old. DNA degrades over time. It's possible the samples are too degraded to yield usable genetic material. Second, the killer is almost certainly dead. He'd be over 110 years old if he were still alive. So finding him personally is impossible. But finding his descendants might be possible. And that could at least give Lili's story some closure. A name, an identity, an answer to who killed her. Third, there's the question of whether Swedish authorities want to invest the resources. The case is 92 years old. Everyone involved is dead. Justice, in the traditional sense, is impossible. But finding his descendants might be possible. And that could at least give Lili's story some closure. A name, an identity, an answer to who killed her. Third, there's the question of whether Swedish authorities want to invest the resources. The case is 92 years old. Everyone involved is dead. Justice, in the traditional sense, is impossible. But some cases demand answers regardless of practical considerations. The Atlas vampire is one of them. In all the talk of vampires and forensic evidence and unsolved mysteries, it's easy to forget the most important person in this story. Lili Lindström, a real woman, with a real life, real dreams, real struggles. We know she was 32 years old when she died. We know she'd been married once, divorced by the time of her death. We know she worked as a sex worker to support herself, that she was successful enough to afford her own apartment and a telephone line. We know she had friends. Minnie Jansen cared enough about her to notice when she disappeared, to go to the police, to insist something was wrong. We know clients liked her enough to become regulars, to trust her with their secrets, their desires, their vulnerabilities. She wasn't just a victim, she was a person. And she deserved better than to die face down on her bed with her skull crushed and her blood drained. She deserved better than to become a sensational headline. The vampire murder, a gothic curiosity, a macabre tourist attraction in a police museum. She deserved justice, protection, safety. She deserved to live past 32. But someone took that from her. And whoever that person was, they escaped punishment. They got to live their life. Maybe had a family, career, grew old, died naturally. White Lili's life ended in violence and horror on Walpurgis Night, 1932. After the Atlas vampire murder made headlines across Sweden, police in Stockholm braced for copycat crimes. It's a common pattern in sensational murder cases. Someone reads about a notorious crime and decides to emulate it. But no copycat crimes occurred. No other sex workers in Stockholm were found drained of blood. No other murders showed the same bizarre elements: the gravy ladle, the careful positioning of the body, the consumption of blood. This suggested several possibilities. Possibility number 1. The killer had been satisfied by the one murder. Perhaps he'd fantasized about killing and drinking blood for years, and once he'd finally done it, the reality didn't live up to the fantasy. The guilt was too great. The fear of being caught was too intense. So he stopped, never killed again. Possibility number 2. The killer died shortly after.
Suicide. Accident.
Natural causes. Something removed him from the equation before he could kill again. Possibility number 3. The killer left Stockholm. Perhaps he was a traveler, a sailor, someone just passing through. He committed the murder and then left the city, never to return. Possibility number 4. The killer was caught for a different crime. Perhaps he committed another crime, something unrelated to the Lili Lindström murder, and was imprisoned or executed. So he was prevented from killing again. Possibility number 5. The killer was more controlled than people thought. Perhaps this wasn't an impulsive crime. Perhaps he was capable of controlling his urges, of waiting months or years between killings. Perhaps there were other victims, in other cities, other countries, murders that were never connected to the Atlas vampire because they happened too far away or were attributed to different killers. We'll never know which possibility is correct. But the fact that there were no obvious copycat crimes or follow-up murders is one of the strangest aspects of this case. Most serial killers escalate. They kill again and again. The Atlas vampire killed once, or at least only once that we know of, and disappeared. In 2007, the Atlas vampire case experienced a brief resurgence of public interest. A Swedish documentary filmmaker requested access to the evidence. He wanted to see if modern forensic techniques could shed new light on the 75-year-old case. Permission was granted. Forensic specialists examined the evidence. They were able to develop a partial DNA profile from the hair samples found at the scene. But the profile was incomplete, degraded, not sufficient for definitive identification or database matching. They examined the fingerprints, enhanced them with modern imaging techniques. But without a suspect to compare them to, they were still useless. They analyzed the bloodstains on the gravy ladle, confirmed it was Lili's blood, but that was already known. The conclusion: the evidence was valuable but limited by its age and the lack of a suspect to compare it against. Unless someone came forward with new information, a family story, a confession from a relative, something, the case would remain unsolved. That was in 2007. It's now 2025. Another 18 years have passed. The evidence continues to age. The possibility of solving the case continues to diminish. But hope never entirely dies. The Atlas vampire case has had a lasting impact on Swedish culture and true crime history. It's referenced in crime fiction, TV shows, podcasts, YouTube videos. Musicians have written songs about it. Swedish musician Erik Malmberg released an instrumental track in 2007 titled Till min Av Lili Lindström, in memory of Lili Lindström. The case appears in lists of the world's most mysterious unsolved murders. The Sweden's most famous cold case. They're Jack the Ripper, their Zodiac killer. But unlike Jack the Ripper or the Zodiac, who killed multiple people over extended periods, the Atlas vampire's infamy comes from a single, bizarre murder. That singularity is part of what makes it so haunting. One night, one victim, one inexplicable crime, and then nothing. Silence. As if the killer materialized, committed this grotesque act, and then dematerialized back into the void. The case has also influenced how Sweden handles cold cases. The preservation of evidence from the Atlas vampire murder, keeping it displayed in the police museum rather than destroying it or filing it away in forgotten storage, set a precedent. Other cold case evidence is now carefully maintained, with the hope that future technology might provide answers that current technology cannot. The Atlas vampire taught Swedish law enforcement an important lesson. Never give up on the unsolved, because you never know when a breakthrough might come. After more than 90 years, these questions remain. Who was the killer? A client Lily knew? A stranger who'd somehow obtained her phone number? Someone from the building? A random psychopath who happened to choose her? Why did he drain her blood? Sexual gratification? Mental illness? A genuine belief he needed blood to survive? A ritual or occult practice? How did he drain her blood so thoroughly? The medical examiner said there were no significant puncture wounds beyond the head trauma. So how did he extract nearly all her blood? Why the gravy ladle? Was it premeditated? Did he bring it with him? Or was it improvised? Did he grab it from Lily's kitchen in the moment? Why did he never kill again? Or did he and we just don't know about it? Could the case ever be solved? With modern DNA technology, is there still a chance? Or has too much time passed? These questions have haunted investigators, journalists, and true crime enthusiasts for nearly a century. And unless new information comes to light, a deathbed confession, a family secret revealed, a breakthrough in forensic technology, they'll remain unanswered forever. Lily Lindström died on Walpurgis Night, 1932, in a small apartment in Stockholm's Atlas district. Her killer was never caught, never identified, never brought to justice, but her story has endured. Not because of the sensational elements, the blood drinking, the vampire mythology, the gothic horror of it all, but because it represents something fundamental about justice and closure. When someone is murdered and the killer escapes, it creates a wound in society that never fully heals. The family of the victim lives with unanswered questions forever. Friends wonder if they could have done something to prevent it. The community feels unsafe because they know a killer walked among them and was never caught. And the victim, in this case Lily, becomes frozen in time as the murder victim, rather than being remembered as the full person she was. Today, if you walk down Sankt Eriksplan in Stockholm, you can stand in front of number 11. The building still exists. It's been renovated multiple times since 1932, but the structure is the same. People live there now. They go about their daily lives. They don't think about what happened there 93 years ago, but the history is there, in the walls, in the floorboards, in the collective memory of a city that once trembled at the thought of a vampire walking its streets. The case file remains open. Officially, the Stockholm Police Department has never closed the Atlas vampire investigation. In theory, someone could still come forward with information. A family member could find letters or a diary from a grandfather or great-grandfather. A DNA match could be found. But realistically, the case will never be solved. The killer is long dead. Everyone who knew him is dead. The trail went cold 90 years ago. What remains is the story, the mystery, the haunting image of a young woman lying face down on her bed, her life stolen, her blood drained, her killer vanished into the Stockholm night. In recent years, there's been a movement to remember victims of unsolved crimes not as mysteries but as people, to say their names, to acknowledge their lives beyond their deaths. So let's do that now. Lily Lindström, she was 32 years old. She was divorced. She worked as a sex worker to support herself. She had friends who cared about her. She had clients who trusted her. She had a life that mattered. She deserved better than what happened to her. She deserved justice that never came. And she deserves to be remembered, not as the Atlas vampire victim, but as Lily, a woman whose life was stolen on a spring night in Stockholm, a woman whose killer escaped, a woman whose story reminds us that some mysteries are never solved, and some injustices are never made right. If you've made it this far, if you've listened to this complete story, thank you. Thank you for caring about a woman who died almost a century ago. Thank you for keeping her memory alive by listening to her story. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Like this video. Share it with someone who loves unsolved mysteries and true crime. Turn on notifications for more stories like this. And let me know in the comments. Where did you listen to this story from? What time is it where you are? And do you think the Atlas vampire case could ever be solved with modern forensic technology? The Atlas vampire remains one of the world's most haunting unsolved murders. A crime so bizarre, so inexplicable, that even after 93 years, it still captivates and disturbs us. Stockholm has moved on. The city has changed. The Atlas district has transformed. But somewhere in the city's archives, in police museums, in old newspapers and fading photographs, Lily Lindestrom's story remains, waiting, just like the case itself, still unsolved, still haunting, still reminding us that sometimes the monsters get away. May Lily Lindestrom rest in peace, and may her story never be forgotten. Until the next mystery,